Hello, I'm Tom Boone, Content Manager at Simple Flying, and welcome to our latest webinar interview. The 2024 edition of the Farnborough International Airshow is now within touching distance. After the 2022 show was slightly subdued by the lasting effects of COVID, this year's show is set to be one to keep an eye on. In fact, it's the first time that the show has sold out of exhibition space for decades. As always, Simple Flying will have a team of reporters on the ground at this year's Farnborough Airshow, ready to bring you all the latest news from around the showground as it happens. Ahead of the show, however, we're joined now by Gareth Rogers, Chief Executive Officer of Farnborough International, for a sneak peek of what's in store later this month. So I guess sort of the first really important question on the airshow is, why is it so important both for the aerospace industry but also for the UK?
It's a good question, and it's one that a lot of people miss, I think, is that, yes, Farnborough International Airshow is the world's leading sort of civil and defence aerospace forum. It brings people from around the world. Around 70% of the visitors are global, but it demonstrates a leadership for the UK. It's a change agent. It kind of powers innovation. But if you just purely look at the pure numbers, I think if you look at the last 10 years, I think it's $510 billion worth of deals have been done at the Farnborough Airshow, and that's 5 shows, but actually it's not 5 shows, it's 4 shows because one of them didn't happen. So, and obviously a lot of that goes into the UK supply chain. So, high-end manufacturing jobs, areas of the country which are supported in the Northwest, Midlands, Wales, Northeast, all sorts of areas, including the Farnborough area themselves. There is a huge benefit to the UK coming out of it. And outside of the fact that there's 80,000 people, coming through the gate and visiting the UK, and all the, all the good sort of economic benefits that just come out of that. So hopefully that answers your question. But there's so many benefits; it's difficult to almost just pin down one.
Yeah, no, I can imagine, for me, it's bringing me to the UK, even though I come regularly anyway. I guess before we sort of talk about this year's air show, can you just give me a quick recap of the last Farnborough Air Show?
Yeah, so I think so. Obviously, the last Farnborough Air Show was the sort of first major global air show out of COVID. So the orders were down a little, around 51 billion. But very much the focus of the industry was on delivery at that point and coming back. But, we had 1,600 registered media, nearly 1,300 exhibitors, nearly 75,000 visitors, 250 official delegations, 41 aircraft in the flying display. I think we had around 90 aircraft on display as well. So you get the sense of what it is, but that's expected to grow this year because actually we're sold out from a trade perspective. So those numbers will go upwards.
And speaking of this year, what should we expect from the 2024 Air Show?
Obviously, there are the traditional parts around deals, and the industry is very strong. I think it's got its. I think the civil aerospace industry has the longest lead times or lead order times that it's ever had, and those numbers continue to grow as the industry, whilst in rude health from an orders perspective, is still building back. It's still creating its capability, and is not necessarily able to meet all those orders. So, naturally expect a significant number of orders, but at the same time, we're there to not only do business, but create conversation, like we said, create innovation, but also create discussion. So we have our Aerospace Global Forum, which is about looking at the big macro challenges of the world through a global aerospace and defense lens. So clearly sustainability is one of those big things, and the net zero challenge, but not just in civil, also in defense as well. How do we deal with space? We have a specific space zone, but also with a space conference as well alongside that. We have urban air, because obviously that's one of the main challenges, and how, particularly around the regulatory pieces, how do we get these things flying? How do we get them working in and around countries and in and around our current infrastructure? But of course, then, we've got the usual global leaders, Airbus, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, RTX, formerly Raytheon, GKN, GE Aviation. I could go on. But like I said, it's sold out for the first time in decades. Probably up to around 1,500 exhibitors from 40 countries. And I think we've got even an increase on the media attendance. We've got around 1,800 global media in attendance. So I appreciate that's a lot in one answer. But like you said, there is a lot to look forward to. So
Definitely, I'm definitely looking forward to it. I guess a big question for many, and also from me, that I'm sure many would love to know the answer to is, what changes have been made this year as a response to the record heat that we saw at Farnborough last year?
Yeah, so well, firstly, we've invested further in our air conditioning. We're also we've also invested in not only the actual the technology and the gear behind it, but actually what we'll call heat-saving technologies. So screens across doors, making sure that we have people closing doors, signage to remind people of that. But also one of the smaller changes, which might seem small, but actually a big change, should I say, is going to take the air from inside the units themselves and recycle that air with the outside air. So it's not just taking the hot air outside, which should hopefully make it cooler. So look, I think we're all hoping that it's not the hottest day the UK has ever seen again. But as we sit in the UK at the moment, the temperatures are up in the mid to late 20s Celsius, sort of early 80s Fahrenheit. But that would be a nice temperature for it to remain at, I think.
Yep, I've definitely got my fingers crossed. I know last 2 years ago, my mother kept texting me, I hope you're drinking water. I hope you're staying out of the sun. And, I was just bumping between all of these places with the air conditioning, and it was lovely. But, obviously, you've just talked a bit about the planning for the heat, but a huge amount of planning and effort goes into making the air show a success. Can you give us sort of an insight into the process, maybe from first steps to validation week and then the doors opening to the public?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is we start planning the air show before the last one takes place. So the planning would have started in 22, but it is genuinely a 2-year planning process. But the actual build started in January this year, with then the structures going up in sort of late February, early March. The exhibitors are allowed on site to build their wares, so they have a 3-week window to build what they need to build. And we have, just to give you a sense of the scale, in the 2 weeks beforehand, we have approximately 4,000 contractors on site, numerous deliveries coming in and around, forklifts sort of whizzing everywhere. It really is a hub of activity. And then that takes us to validation week, where if you're in and around the Farnborough area, you'll see that the aircraft practicing their routines, which they have to do from a safety perspective. We then do all our final checks on the weekend before, and many of our exhibitors will be in and around the area, and then we open the doors 6 a.m. on Monday morning. Hopefully not to 40 degrees heat, but just to a nice sunny day, and looking forward to welcoming the world to our corner of Hampshire.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting that you mentioned sort of the safety aspect just there, because that was leading nicely into my next question. I remember when I was a lot younger, going to the Farnborough Airshow, you'd see the full sort of red arrows display, and then we unfortunately had the Shoreham crash. And now, sort of ever since then, we just get the fly past on day one. I was wondering how much of an impact does the lack of these big aerobatic displays have on the show as a whole in your eyes?
Firstly, there will be aerobatic displays. So we have the Royal Danish Air Force demonstrating the F-16. Sorry, apologies. It's the Boeing F-15 display team that will do a clean and dirty display, and then the Royal Danish Air Force will do a display. So we will have aerobatics, dynamic displays. It's a myth that you can't fly aerobatic dynamic displays at Farnborough. Yes, the Shoreham disaster that happened, it meant that the rules were tightened, and rightly so. Of course they should have been. It was a very sad and a very disastrous event. But that hasn't stopped flying. But if you look back at the last show, we were in the start of a European conflict, in Ukraine, and naturally many of the usual actors who would have flown, were on standby, and that's not really surprising. But at the same time as that, we've also got the Turkish Herjet debuting as well, which will be great to see. Airbus flying their C295, but as well we will have Airbus and Air India. Given their growth, they're looking to fly. They'll be flying the A350, which I said on many a time. It always amazes me how quiet it is when you compare that versus what you will see with the F-35, which is coming to hover over the site as well. I know that happened last time, and I think the whole site shook as it sort of hovered for 30 seconds. And then on a Friday with sort of Pioneers of Tomorrow, we're also adding sort of wing walkers and Rich Goodwin's display team and various other things as well. So a really full flying display, and also, just as importantly, those dynamic flying displays, fast jets roaring around the area in Farnborough. Yes, we will have the Red Arrows doing their fly pasts and things, but I know the RAF are very active on in and around the world, and therefore sparing equipment and planes isn't necessarily able to do so. I think it's the same at Riyadh at the weekend before as well. I don't think that they are flying dynamic displays there either.
That's fair enough. Jumping back to 2022 again, I remember at the time Christian Scherer of Airbus said that the timing of orders for air shows isn't so important to him. And I think the quote from him was, "We do business and not show business." From the sort of perspective of the CEO of the air show, how important is it to you that these big aircraft orders are announced at the air show?
Of course, it's always nice to demonstrate the importance of your event. But to me, the importance of the event is demonstrated by the fact that it's sold out. There is no more space left to purchase from an exhibitor perspective. And that's isn't, like as I said earlier, it's not been that way for decades. It's not only that. We have all the major players here. It is, like I said, we have Airbus, Boeing, Rolls-Royce, RTX, GKN, GE. They're all here. BAE, both civil and military. There's certainly an increase in military activity this year for obvious reasons, given the geopolitical situation. And like I said, whilst it's nice to announce those deals, they're here to do business, and they're here to do what they need to do. And if that involves, if that involves those events, so those announcements, then great. But I'm more interested that they do the business that they wanted to do, and we will have, either a new government or a continuation, but more like, and if that's the case, a revamped government, one way or the other, there will be different ministerial presence coming to this show. And we've also got, I think we've invited upwards of 500 international delegations. And we're expecting that number to grow sort of 30-40% from what we had 2 years ago as well. So we really are expecting a conglomeration of the global aerospace industry and the ecosystem that sits around it in terms of ministerial academia. All of those are the people that work off the industry and work for the industry and rely on the industry in order to create a real festival in 3 weeks' time.
Definitely. I'm looking forward to it, certainly. You've been in charge of the air show now for 6 years. I was wondering if you could just walk us through what the biggest changes that you've seen during that time are.
From a Farnborough Airshow perspective, interesting. Once I've been there 6 years, this will only actually be my third air show, because obviously the 2021 was cancelled. And I only joined 6 months before the previous air show. So three things. One, we as Farnborough have really tried to create and create a customer service led mentality where we are consistently talking to our customers throughout the 2-year period, trying to understand what it is they're looking to achieve, helping them amplify their messaging, and continuing asking what it is that they're looking, what would they want? What do they want to see? How can we develop? And one of those developments, I would say, is the second point, is so we have put in place a new investment, which is a government hub for the UK government to create effectively a physical manifestation of themselves, which will be manned by government officials, and it will be in Hall 3. It'll be it'll also give you a bit of taste of Britain at the same time in the UK. But it's about making government more accessible. And I think that's really, really important, because ultimately we are, the world is coming to the UK, and therefore what the government can do, and there's been great support from that. I think we have 9 separate departments manning that across the spectrum of government. And I would say the third one is more around air shows in general. I think that they have become more focused on outcome and what they expect, rather than almost I'm going because I've gone every year. I think that there's definitely more questions being asked of what are we getting out of this show? What are we going to get from it? And that's why we've almost, to me, we've had to do that first point, which is, continually ask those questions and show that customer service.
Definitely. And I guess one of the biggest changes that we have seen in the past sort of several years is that the public weekend has disappeared. Can you walk us a little bit through that decision?
Yeah, so that was a decision taken, I think it was taken 4 years ago. I think there was 2 or 3 angles to it. One is that there's been a proliferation of global air shows and international air shows throughout the world that have spun out in, I would say, the past 10 years. And therefore, trade exhibitors are, and I include both defence and civil on those. The investment that goes into 7 days is greater than it goes into 5, and therefore, from an industry perspective, that there was less of an appetite to demonstrate their craft more than they wanted to, because they're doing it all over the world. And one of the most expensive parts for those larger primes of the air show is actually demonstrating their aircraft. Certainly the civil aircraft, they've got to take those aircraft out of service. And, particularly given there's a continuing growth of backlog of orders, it's very difficult to say to a customer, I can't deliver your aircraft because I'm showing it to somebody else. That's a very difficult message to give. So there's that piece. I think, secondly, we didn't feel that we were offering value for money as to what we wanted to do. And that there were other air displays in the UK that could offer that value for money. And thirdly, and one of the largest pieces, and this was probably, I would say, one of the biggest drivers, was that industry themselves had come to us and said, our biggest issue is the shortfall of qualified workforce, and it's only going to get worse. How do you help us do that? And whilst the public air show did that in a way, what we decided is, actually, if we can make that part of the trade show where they were not only just aircraft in the sky, but those organizations could speak to school leavers, to students, to apprentices. So we felt that would give them a better opportunity to address that shortfall. So that happens on the Friday in Pioneers of Tomorrow. Under 21s are free, students are free, apprentices are free. So we're still, there is more aircraft on display. I think I mentioned earlier that we've got some wing walkers coming on the Friday. Rich Goodwin's display team coming on the Friday as well. And it really is not only that, we have a careers fair. We have industry changing the people who are on their stands, particularly the larger organizations, to be more focused to those people, if that makes sense. And I guess as well, it's about inspiring the next generation of leaders, innovators, pioneers, engineers. There's a wealth of career opportunities, both civil and military. And it's never just about flying the aircraft. There's a whole host of things. Yes, it was a tough decision. It's not a decision that we enjoyed taking, but we feel that we've got the balance right, given that there is the Royal International Air Tattoo the weekend before, and that we offer something different on the Friday, but also something that generates a benefit for the industry, and not just about making money on ticket sales and getting people through the door. I think it's just as important to inspire the whole spectrum of young people and not just a certain demographic.
Definitely. I guess finally, a nice question to end on. What are your favorite memories of the air show?
Well, I never actually been to the Farnborough Airshow until I started working in 2018. I'm actually from the north of England originally, but it's not from the Farnborough Airshow. But what inspired me into it is I won some tickets in the local newspaper to the Finningley Airshow in I think it was 1987. That's a long time ago, isn't it? It's not even an RAF base anymore, and I've been fascinated ever since, sort of with aircraft, aerospace, and those sort of things, and therefore getting this role was really, really exciting from my perspective. But what my great memories are just the noise that the jets make. That they make the ground shake. It doesn't matter where you are on the site, and I love it in validation week, where you may be doing some work, you not quite realize they're about to start, and you kind of suddenly are deafened out of nowhere, and it's wonderful to see. And I probably one of the favorite memories actually just getting everybody back together in 2022 after COVID. That was a real highlight, to be able to be part of that and be able to deliver that for the aerospace industry.
Well, Gareth, thank you so much for your time. I can't wait to be in Farnborough in just under a month and to say hello in person. But once again, thank you.
Pleasure. Look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks.
Thank you.
In addition to our daily YouTube videos, Simple Flying publishes over 150 articles every week. If you're looking for the latest aviation news and insights, visit simpleflying.com.